All right, so we are here again with Bishop Ken Carter. Ken, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing, Jason?
I'm good. I'm good. Or do you prefer Bishop?
Ken's good. That's good. Yeah.
So, how long have you been in Western North Carolina now?
You know, I came back here to serve as bishop in September of 21, and I've been only here since January of 23. I think that's correct. This was my home annual conference, so I started serving as a pastor here in '83. So I have a long history
Okay.
with you. Yeah.
Where in North Carolina are you from?
Well, I grew up in Georgia. My wife is from Kernersville, which is near Winston-Salem, Greensboro. And
Okay.
we liked Western North Carolina. So that's where we started in ministry. She's a pastor, was a pastor as well. And so, but um, served in Greensboro, Winston-Salem, Charlotte, and then the mountains as a superintendent briefly. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I also served as a student pastor in Amherst County in Virginia for a little while
Oh, yeah.
when I was at UVA. So I have one of those diplomas from UVA that takes up half of the wall. You know the one I'm talking about. So,
I do. Yeah.
so I served two small. I preached at two small churches on the weekend in Amherst County. Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Uh, we have a house not too far from Amherst, so
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's great. So you have a new book called "Unrelenting Grace: A United Methodist Way of Life," and it's a pretty little book too, um, which I think is often important. But I think before you dive into the book, tell me about the title. What is the theology behind "Unrelenting Grace"?
Well, it's a book about grace, how God's grace pursues us. It is the nature of God to be moving toward us in the incarnation and salvation. And so we looked at different titles. Relentless Grace was one of them, and we just fell with unrelenting. But it really is God's extravagant love and grace for us, which is lifelong, and that's where it begins. So the nature of God and who God is, how God's moving in the world and in our lives and in our communities. Yeah.
Uh, Stanley Hauerwas jokes about how whenever United Methodists use the word grace, they have no idea what they're talking about.
Mhm.
And so, as a leader in our denomination, sir, why don't you provide everyone a working definition for the word?
Well, I think grace is, for me, it is that Ephesians 2:8 and 9, by grace we have been saved through faith. This is the gift of God, not the result of our works, lest we should boast. So for me, and that verse was very important to me, I would say, in my young adult faith. It is that it's a gift, that God's love is a gift, that acceptance is that somehow I can earn God's favor through a good thing that I'm doing. But it is simply God's acceptance of us, which is not the end, but is an important beginning. And it's not that we accept grace, we check a box, um, it's settled. Uh, Grace for us moves on beyond justification, that we're made right with God, Romans 5, etc., to towards sanctification, that we love God, we love our neighbor, and that that is lifelong. So, and I love Stanley Hauerwas. Yeah.
I knew you did. I knew you did. So you structured. So talk about like how you structured the book here, because it's clearly meant to be used
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
small groups.
So this book really came about. I was leaving Florida after 10 years of serving there and just returning to Western North Carolina. And they asked me, they had a going away gathering for me. Bishops transitioned 1st of January. And so that was an unusual time to say goodbye, certainly in the month of December. And I was a pastor for 28 years. Most pastors have a very full slate in the month of December and not a lot of time to go to annual conference gatherings. So we did have a going away service at a church in Tampa, Florida, and it was videoed, it was live streamed. And the people in the publishing house saw what I'd said. And I was just trying to tie some things together and say that our important values are grace, connection, and holiness. Uh, and and we had been through a lot in Florida those 10 years, the murder of Trayvon Martin, the Pulse murders, Parkland. We had United Methodist churches very close to all those
Hmm.
events. Uh, and two major hurricanes, not to mention that Florida is the home of many national political presidential figures, and that is a part of the ethos and the denominational conversations around unity and division. So all that was going on, and so I was just trying to anchor us, and this is what is important. This is what's been important for me, and I think the book, which when the publishing house asked me if I would sort of put it in the form of a book, it's really for people to go back to some foundation, some basics uh, in a kind of a difficult time. And so the basic idea is that God's grace, our connection, our journey to holiness are our pathways to healing. And that most people who would read this book, whether they are leaders of local churches or pastors, have been trying to hold churches together. They've been trying to hold families and communities together, and perhaps they've been harmed in some way. How do we move toward healing? And so the book is also about healing to a great extent. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the first chapter, you identify two challenges to our discipleship as United Methodists.
Right.
Um, and I and one of the things I like about how you're tackling this too is you're putting it in the plural, right?
Mhm.
That I think oftentimes in the church we talk about discipleship as something we're all doing together as individuals,
Right. Right.
um, rather than what we're doing as a identifiable people. And so, talk about these two challenges to our collective discipleship.
Well, I do believe that being a follower of Jesus is the heart of it. And that's certainly something I've not mastered. But it's a journey. I'm trying to follow Jesus, and we are trying to be disciples. We're trying to be communities of disciples, and yet we have these two unfinished pieces of work that are before us. And this is really written to, hopefully, to United Methodist. I'm not trying to argue with people who are not United Methodist or want to go in a different direction. Is trying to anchor us in who we are. And so a part of it is the historic racism that is a part of life and the church. And sometimes when I sit back and think about the history of Christianity, it is a miracle that uh, Black persons embrace the Christian faith. And I think
Hmm.
a lot of people have commented about this, but simply they could easily have not done that. And our relationships with Black persons and enslaving them and suppressing them um, has surely been an obstacle to their being and embracing faith. It's a sign to me of the supernatural miracle
Yeah.
of Christianity that this happened. It so easily could not have happened. And so a part of the historic racism is what we can learn from the Black church and what they can teach us about maturity, about reconciliation and forgiveness, about integrating a personal faith in the public space, and all of those things. And so that's a part of it, uh, the challenge to our discipleship, and then the LGBTQ community. And again, I was a pastor for 28 years. I come at this more pastorally than ideologically. I just had more experiences almost than I can count where a person call me and say, Reverend Carter, can I see you on my way home from work? Could we have breakfast in the morning? Can I call you later today? Would you meet with me and my son or daughter tomorrow? And they were trying to hold their faith and their relationship with someone they loved together. They were just trying to hold
Hmm.
those things together, see how they fit. And so that's also a part of it. That's the unfinished work we have before us. And I think I say in the book that the harm we've done to these two segments of persons is staggering. I mean, it's just staggering. I mean, I often say about gay and lesbian persons. For me, a main character in our denomination, in our church, could be any church, is the person who was born into a church, baptized, attended Sunday school, confirmed in a youth group, maybe in a campus ministry. As an adult, they serve in the church, they're a leader, they contribute money to the church, and at the end of their life, do they wonder, was this ever my church?
Hmm.
And that kind of person became a central character for me, and why we singled these persons out for discrimination. And so that's sort of a part of the book as we get started. So, and which you've
So,
identified.
so I mean, so take off your grace hat for a minute and put on your bishop hat, and
Mhm. Yeah.
why has the why have these people and this issue been so central and time
Mhm.
consuming in the United Methodist Church?
Well, if you're talking about, I think LGBTQ, that the relationships with
Hmm.
that community, we're a relatively young church, 50 or 60 years old, I guess, and this just got into our discipline almost immediately after we became a denomination. It really got in there um, at a general conference in an unplanned kind of way. And it was simply there when at the time when this got into our book of discipline, um, this was LG, gay and lesbian identity was identified in the scientific community as a disease.
Hmm.
And this was the culture in which this arose in the American Medical Association, Psychiatric Association, and it's simply been a part of our life ever since. And I do think pastorally, people have had relationships with persons in local churches, along whom they've been disciples. They've been in Bible studies together, sung in choirs together, gone on mission trips together, attended seminary together, all those things. And we simply have had the same two sentences about this community of people in our discipline, and that's just been unchanged. And so, I think the another way I've looked at this is the way I frame the question is seeing the evidence of the Holy Spirit in persons' lives, and the language I've used is that we are on the same journey toward holiness. And so I think those are some of the ways I've framed that. It has been it has been at the heart of division of the division of our church, and we continue to struggle with it. Yeah.
And I know that, just so any United Methodists who are listening to this, their next question is going to be, well, uh, now that disaffiliation is has happened and is happening and hopefully tapering off, what what do you see in the immediate future?
My hope, and I've said this in writing and sermons in public, even before the Judicial Council, my hope is that we'll remove these sentences from the Book of Discipline. They're these two or three sentences, and I just don't believe they are helpful to us or to persons. In I think 2013, I gave I had a talk with a large group of LGBTQ persons in Orlando. It was the first year I was a bishop. And I just had the sense that on the matter of gay and lesbian persons in the church, uh, this was not something I could kind of evade or sort of, I love sports, sort of dribble the ball at half court until the clock runs out.
Uh-huh.
And
Hmm.
I just couldn't do that. And that was not helpful to anyone. And so I thought, well, I'd rather not make a statement about this. I'd rather meet with some people. So there was a church in Orlando, Florida that is a large church, has a large ministry to persons not far from Disney, St. Luke's United Methodist. And so there were about 250 people there on a Thursday evening. And one of the things I said was this sentence, these two or three sentences undermine the moral teaching office of our church in the same way that birth control does for the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
Most people in their families, in their churches, in their Sunday school classes, in their workplaces, most people understand um, the human nature, the gifts of the Spirit, the fellow journey when they are Christians and following Jesus of persons in this community. Intuitively, they understand that, uh, but we have actually the Book of Discipline has a lot of wonderful material in it, and uh, it is a work in progress, you know. So, but so that's how I've seen it as a bishop. And I would also say when there have been complaints about related to homosexuality, I have tried to respond to those using the principles of restorative justice. And restorative justice is a value in our Book of Discipline, and it is a value, a stated value in the complaint paragraphs of the Book of Discipline.
Hmm.
And so restorative justice begins with not what law has been broken, but who has been harmed and how can we be restored into a right relationship with each other and with God. I really learned this from the Mennonites. And so I have tried to interpret the Book of Discipline and practice that. You ask about my role in that way. I actually think restorative justice is a great way to go about many things that we struggle with in life. You know?
Sure. 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 That's good. I mean, I agree with you about the moral teaching office. And it's all the more so, right, problematic that this is the one thing that most people know about the Book of Discipline.
Well, and
Like, they don't know
also,
any other part of it.
there are two paragraphs in the Book of Discipline that use the word incompatible with Christian teaching. You likely know this. One is homosexuality. The other is participation in warfare.
Hmm.
And I had people in my own family tree. My grandfather was a conscientious objector. in World War II, which was a very unpopular war to be a conscientious objector in. He was a Quaker. He worked in manual labor in Mobile, Alabama, although he was an engineer, was a graduate of Georgia Tech. My father served in the military. My wife and I have two nephews who served in the military. I've served communion to people. They were getting ready to depart. Sunday school classes raised money for their body armor, you know. And so what the paragraph says is that war is incompatible with Christian teaching. Some United Methodists are pacifist, and some participate in the military, and both are honorable. So it allows for the differentiation, right, in
Hmm.
the topic of that, but somehow does not in the other. So it's yeah, it's a book that is that is again humanly created and is and that's we are all, Paul says, we have the treasure of the gospel in earthen vessels. I'm not criticizing or throwing anything at someone else. We all are trying to do this work. Yeah.
It does strike me that maybe as United Methodists, maybe we're so associated with holiness and sanctification that we're a little naive about
Mm.
um, the ways uh, the ways that all Christians live in a manner that is contrary to Christian teaching.
Right, right. You know, as I was thinking about our conversation and certainly some of your roots, um, at the University of Virginia, I had a class with Carlos Ayer, who was a professor of religious studies, on Calvin. Read the Institutes, and I did a paper on on Calvin and sanctification. And then when I was a pastor, I was near Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Wake Forest University was nearby, and there was a professor there named Ralph Wood who is brilliant.
Mm, yeah.
Carlos Ayer is
Hmm.
brilliant as well, and he was a professor to my wife in her undergraduate studies, a lifelong friend, preached in every church I ever served, scholar of Flannery O'Connor, and but he taught a class on Bart and paper on Bart and sanctification, and looking back, and of course both of those were a long time ago. That was just the Wesleyan in me wanting to figure out sanctification, not through the narrow prism of one tradition, but what I do love about Wesleyan theology, and then the third name I'll drop, I guess, was I was involved in some things at Princeton with the pastor theologian program and something called the Pastors Working Group with Craig Dykstra. And so around a lot of people who loved the Reformed tradition and really modeled it. And one time, Craig Dykstra said, and he's very Reformed. Again, I learned a great deal from him, no buts. He said, Reformed theology is a cul-de-sac. And I thought about the image of driving around in a cul-de-sac. As messy as Wesleyan theology is, we are trying to drive out of the cul-de-sac
Hmm.
into the
Hmm.
world. The critique of us is that we can be chameleon. You know, we can just mirror the world, reflect the world. So maybe, you know, a Hauerwas might say grace is just this is not his image, but another person's grace is just pouring syrup on everyone's pancakes. You know, whatever, whatever you want, whatever you're struggling with, have some grace. And uh, and so, but the positive side is that we're sincerely trying to figure out what it means to be on a journey to holiness. And another, you know, and so Dykstra's work on practices, where he talks about practices in the complicated places where people really live. And I think that's the way I would characterize all of this conversation. The What we're trying to say is we want to be a church for everyone, and that's not like banner in a parade, but we want God's grace to penetrate the complicated places where we all live and transform us. And that's to me kind of who we are at our best. Yeah, which
Yeah, I
we
was
are
thinking,
at our best. Yeah, yeah.
I was looking at your book. I was thinking about, you know, like places I've done guest preaching. Um, I've been received most warmly, and I would characterize them, as kind of like evangelical Episcopal churches.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
and I'm like, oh, well, of course, because that's like who we're supposed to be.
Absolutely,
Like,
absolutely.
um, yeah. So that's uh, Tier on the podcast wasn't able to join us, but he's been struggling with a question, and so I'll pose it to you because it's related to your book. So he's a couple of months into a new appointment, and he started doing Romans, the lectionary text this summer as an introduction to him for his new congregation, and he's gotten a lot of pushback to the message of grace, and people wanting to be told what to do. And do you have any wisdom as a pastor and as a bishop in how to help this message take root in a congregation where maybe it's been forgotten?
You know, well, I do think I remember Richard Hayes' commentary on, I think it's Romans 1, 2, and 3, where he begins by saying, you know, in human nature, human nature rejected God and had the law but didn't fulfill it. And then he comes a little closer and talks about the Gentiles and how they did not live up to God's purpose for them. But then he sort of zeroes in on his own people, the Jewish people, and says, "But we have the law, and we did not follow it. And then of course the all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But the free gift later on is God's grace, and I think grace is pretty radical for most of us, and most people we probably encounter really have worked hard in life to get somewhere, to accomplish something. They've seen boundaries violated and maybe been harmed by that, and sometimes they want a pastor to identify those boundaries and maybe prevent the
Hmm.
harm. Um, and they want other people to have to follow the same rules we followed, or we perceive we have followed. And of course, that's Matthew 20, the laborers in the vineyard. When the people come at different times of day. But that we are this only within the household of faith through grace is probably something we all have to be at a place of beginning constantly through our lives. There's a great Walter Brueggemann has a great simple framework in his book The Creative Word on the Old Testament, where he talks about the law is kind of the law is related to childhood, which is, don't pick up that piece of paper off the ground and eat it. Don't cross the road unless you're holding your parent's hand. Very strict formulaic laws. And then the prophets sort of are the adolescent rebellion. This is in his book Creative Word. And the adolescent rebellion is you have the law, but you're not following it. How teenagers just have a way of seeing that in us. How we don't exactly live according to our convictions. And then there is, he says, the maturity of wisdom, which is the Psalms and, Job and Ecclesiastes and etc., where we are trying to integrate our life experience with our faith. And I think grace, and I think this is a part of what's going on in the book. Most of us, if we wrote down what we've been through the last few years, it's been a lot, and not everyone has experienced this in the same way. But in my wife and I and our family, we lost a stepfather and an aunt and a cousin to COVID.
Mm.
Uh, Example, a lot of important rituals we didn't gather for. Um, and
Yeah.
a person I ordained died of COVID, and in Florida. Um, and so people in the pews have been through a lot. And so a part of what's going on in the book is we need God's grace. And many of us have not been at our best on many of these days. And so we need grace extended to us, and we're called to extend that same grace to others. And so it's how we begin to do that. I would also say, and I don't ordinarily share something like this, but I try to write out a prayer every day. And this morning, the
Mm.
sentence that occurred to me was, for myself, help me to live out of gratitude and not grievance. And I think grievance is just such a powerful thing in our culture. And I was
Yeah.
identifying it in my own life, things I complain about, things I want to see more of in other people. But help me just to back up and give thanks for gifts and blessings. And so that's what is grace in contrast to, and I think part of it is that we want to be, it's the works righteousness thing, which I think in American Christianity, 30,000 foot view, that's a challenge we all kind of work on, and
Hmm.
but it's also, how does grace maybe relate to grievance? And I never thought about it till this morning, that it's grievance is so powerful. It's
Well, and
just
it's the polarity that Luke 15 presents us with.
absolutely, it's the older brother, yeah, and that you're eating with sinners, and I think so that's, and I just am great, thank God that he's serving in that church, and um, and planting those seeds, yeah.
So you you mentioned that we haven't always acted well the last few years. We have another culture dividing election coming up in the next year,
Right.
which I think will be another unpleasant experience for a lot of people. And you have a section in the second chapter about um, how we see each other.
Mhm.
Um, and so I'm wondering, from the perspective of grace, how do we um, uh, bear witness to things that matter and not become
Mhm.
apathetic, but
Yeah.
also not perpetuate cultural antagonisms?
Yeah, I think for me, it's simply not to try to be captive to such a binary way of seeing people, but trying to see the image of God in every person. So uh, this is not in the book, but I think a part of it is, but so last a year and 3 4 months ago, I was walking in a grocery store, and my brain said, "You have just stepped in a puddle of water." And immediately I hit the floor. I hit the floor with my shoulder and my head. And I mean, I hit it hard, and I was not walking fast. It's just the nature of really slippery grocery store floors and water. So I was there, and immediately this woman came to me, got down with me, and said, "Don't move." She said, "Don't move." So they called to make a long story short, they called the ambulance, took me to the hospital. Um, a couple of days later, I saw an orthopedic person, began therapy. It was a broken, fractured humerus, but I did not end up
Hmm.
having to have surgery. My daughter was with me, and she said, the woman who was with you had on a T-shirt that said, "Let's go, Brandon." And and I think I have told that story a lot. That how do our divisions get erased? When we are in need of each other. And I think a part of the power of a story like the Good Samaritan, when
I was just gonna, yeah.
Amy Jill Levine talks about it, is how the enemy becomes my neighbor and helps. And I think I would say for pastors is to try to find narratives that mess with our hardened divisions. Does that make sense? And
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think and I would say in the United Methodist Church, I've been deeply, deeply shaped by the very traditional theology of our church.
Hmm.
People who, there's in one of my books, I talk about a conversation with Billy Abraham that we had, and he passed this past year, but he read this in the book when it came out and wrote me about it. And it was a conversation where we were leaving a worship service, and I just said to him, uh, Billy, I don't know if we're going to end up in the same church, but I need to say to you, I've always been a very important teacher to me. And I want you to know that. And he looked at me, he's, Northern Irish, and he said, Ken, keep following your lights. And then he repeated that, keep following your lights. I think this story is in God Will Make a Way. And I don't know what that meant, what he was saying, but and I don't want to be the hero of a story, but how we can, um, how what is the third way, and I think as hard as this is right now, I mean, and I'm just in the midst of recording things for our called sessions. A lot of conferences are having them. I appeal to people, and I try to practice this, not to demonize or disparage the other person, because a generation from now, this has happened before. We divide and we reunite. And if we can minimize the bad blood that is there, it prepares the way for people in the future to, to find a way back
Hmm.
to each other. Clearly, younger generations have zero issue with LGBTQ identity or practice,
Hmm.
almost non-existent. And I've heard the head of the Pew Research twice talk about that. So, and a part of that is, my daughter told me one time, our daughters are mid and younger 30s. One of my daughters read one of those Pew things one time, and it said that like 5% of people her age go to church. So she said that's 1 out of 20 people. And if you're 1 out of 20 people of your age group who are attending a church, you're not looking for ways to divide yourselves. She's just looking
Yeah,
for some.
yeah.
she- They're just looking for a place where, and of course, she has deep friendships with people of other faiths. But anyway, I think that's a part of it is, and it's within the context of connection. How we connect to other people. Yeah.
So speaking of the connection, um, to pivot to the next part of your book, um, how do you counsel people to think about building an institution for the future?
Could you say that again? Uh,
Yeah, so you mentioned the connection, and so in the third chapter, you've got a section
mhm.
about building an institution for the future.
Right.
You know,
Right.
How do you think we go about doing that?
Well, I think, I've really given a lot of thought the last few years to the relationship between institutions and movements, and like renewal movements in churches or movements in general. And we all need institutions for the goods they provide. And there's a great book by Timothy Snyder, who teaches history at Yale. It's called On Tyranny. And it's a very short book, but it talks about the dismantling of institutions and how harmful that is, especially to the most vulnerable. And I'm an institutional person. Institutions are not perfect, but institutions are, they care for people and they make opportunities possible for people, but they can become rigid and inflexible and lose their originating purpose. And so how we can have just enough institution to provide for the needs, the basic needs of persons, and have a lot more openness to movements within our church. And so I think more focus on the local, more horizontal maybe and less vertical. I wrote something years ago about what it means to be a bishop in a post-denominational world, and there's just the hierarchy piece is just not what's important. It
Hmm.
really is. It really is. What I love about my work is trying to give people opportunities to flourish in their callings, and trying to prevent harm from happening in local situations. Those are really a couple of core things. So, I think our all of our institutions will look different. Our denominations will look different. It, 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 I would say one outcome for the United Methodist Church, we're going to be a very strong church, but we were so big, or so we thought, that we really didn't have to be that ecumenical. We could sort of just do it all within ourselves, but so we talk about places that are what are called Methodist deserts. There aren't any Methodist churches there. We've worked on how to build relationships with AME Zion churches that are there, and we have enough buildings, in American churches. How so? That's what's before us, but I don't presume to know what it will look like, or even and I see myself more as a kind of a bridge figure. I have loved being a part of this church and appreciate the opportunities I've had to serve and lead. But I don't feel a desire to have to shape that future church. I feel like my role has been to encourage people and to make opportunities possible for people maybe 10 years younger than me, maybe 20, maybe 30. Uh, and I trust that they will be led to help shape that. It's almost like they will design and build a house that they can live in. And I think my wife has an interior design background in addition to being a minister, and most who do, they would much rather have a role in shaping it than have someone else have shaped it for them. So
I feel like, though, the analogy is to I would love to be able to design my own house, but I inherited this timeshare that I can't get rid of.
yeah,
You
timeshare.
know, so like
That's an ominous
it's
image, but that's great.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, this is just like the institutional part of my own ministry. It's like, well, by most metrics, we're doing great, and
Mhm.
yet I'm saddled with this massive facility that costs an enormous amount of money to keep going. And if we
Mhm.
didn't have to worry about that, um, there's so much other things we could do.
And I think buildings I mean, the Western North Carolina Conference has $3 billion worth of property. And it's used about 11% of the time. And the person who did this work with us, and they had a grant from the Duke Endowment, said retail establishments need to use their facilities 75% of the time. And so how do we repurpose some of this space? And in some places it's happening. How do we repurpose it for affordable housing, attainable housing, co-working space? I'm just, our buildings, many of them, they were designed for life in the 1950s and 60s. And we don't live in the 1950s and 60s. And so you're right. That's that can be that is a challenge. Yeah. And sanctuary, like the conversation we're having digitally, I'm convinced hybrid worship and online worship is not going to take the place of in-person worship, but it is going to be how we do. I mean, you do discipleship and catechesis, and you do that online. And so we didn't build buildings taking that into
Hmm.
account, and so how can our buildings be repurposed and how can we invest in that other space where people spend a lot of their time?
And just kind of thinking about the future again in your role, um, you may not have a need to design the house for
Mm.
the future, but what you know, how pressing? So I don't. So listeners who are United Methodists and have and go to churches, how pressing is this wave of retirements among clergy? How pressing is that going to be for the church?
Well, I think, and I'm not really an expert on the demographics, but the baby boom generation, of which I'm kind of in the middle, is a huge wave of people. And so in Florida, I work with some brilliant people who were Gen X people, which are kind of in between, all these boomers and all these millennials. And so that group is kind of washed through, you know, that baby boomer generation. And I think a part of my role has been to encourage people to, like right now, to lean into a very hard time to try to retrieve these gifts of grace, connection, holiness, and not just kind of search for the exit,
Hmm.
and say this is hard. And I have good friends, amazing people who said to me, I just felt like I just did not have the energy to continue with this. And so I do think that must be coming. I think it's kind of corresponded in some way to decline of the church in some places. Here I hear the voice of Will Willimon, kind of the sober realism, the retirement of baby boomers coinciding with decline of capacity of many churches. My sense is that we need gifted people, and there are plenty of opportunities for people who will lean into the work and of parish ministry. And I think so. I think that that is coming, and I guess retirement is being rethought in many walks of life, and
Hmm.
how people go about that, and how they see timetables and so forth.
So maybe in the time remaining, speaking about the work of parish ministry, you call attention in your last chapter here on the healing ministry of Jesus.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about that because I think that's really important.
I'll start by saying I was a pastor. When I was a pastor, there was a Methodist college near us, and they asked me to teach Old Testament in the fall and New Testament in the spring, kind of one section of that. And and so this hours a week. And with 18-year-olds, you can't like divide them up into small groups and say, talk about this. You actually have to have, an hour and 15 minutes of content, that you're, so they say the way we learn is to teach. And so one of the discoveries I had was how central the healing ministry of Jesus is to everything else. I mean, people cared about his teaching because he was a healer. And so
Mhm.
he heals the man who's born blind, and then he talks about I'm the light of the world. And I mean, those kind of passages. And then I think it was um, a, a couple of injuries I've had the last 10 years. One was a ruptured quad tendon. And this last summer, the shoulder injury, just unrelated, but being in processes of healing and processes of physical therapy, learning to walk again and regain strength again, and so I would pray often, uh, Lord, let me meet a healing person today. If I knew I had a medical,
Mhm.
procedure coming, and you do meet healing people. Sometimes they're a physician, sometimes they're a MRI technician, sometimes they're a nurse or an office manager. Um, and I remember a year or so ago, I was doing physical therapy, which was uh, the process of regaining range of motion. And I'd kind of gotten to know this young guy who had a doctorate in physical therapy. And one day I try to talk to them and learn from them. And so one day he said, just in passing, I have been thinking about going into the ministry. And
Mm.
I said, look at me, you are in the ministry, the ministry of healing. I think there's just so much brokenness, being divided by political parties, the mental and physical exhaustion of trying to hold churches and, again, families together, and votes on disaffiliation or not votes on disaffiliation. That's all a part of it. And there is just a need for healing. And I think I think the church is really called to that. And healing, as I've thought about this, and I'm not a medical person at all, but a lot of healing is things getting into a right relationship with each other. For example, so I had surgery, 10 years ago, on the quad tendon. So you have to get things in alignment, and that's the trying to make peace with God, trying to make peace with each other, offer forgiveness, receive it. And it doesn't happen instantaneously, but then the process of healing happens. And and I do think people are in search of healing communities. And so that's what a lot of the healing means to me. Um, and I do think connection is that relationships are an important part of healing, and
Mhm.
isolation is a significant part of our failure to heal, and failure to so to be whole. So that's a lot of what I thought about, and I was thinking about kind of real relationships, real people, real experiences, and my hope is that's the church can discover that's a lot of our purpose and calling right now.
So, Ken, what is your favorite word?
Favorite word. You know, a word I've thought a lot about lately is curiosity. Just that
Okay.
I'm at my best when I'm most curious, most open to what I don't know, and just, for example, that my life could have has unfolded the way it has is just a real curiosity to me. That I never picked any place I ever served. Didn't pick Florida to serve. I've been assigned to all these places, and the teachers who've kind of come along. Will would be one of them. Stanley would be one of them. The people who've come along, and just the opportunities, even like giving this talk, and then the publishing house hearing it and saying, "Can you make this into a book? And can you do it in a month?" And of course, we all have full time jobs, but I was game for that. So, but just the curiosity is a favorite word, um, and thinking about what is ahead, for all of us, and how that can be life giving, how I can be a part of that. So,
What's your least favorite word?
least favorite word. Um, I don't know. That's a great question. What is my least favorite word? Um, this is going to be. This isn't going to gain universal acclaim, but that something is a just is my least favorite. And by that I mean I am on a journey to justice, but I find in conversations that has the effect of ending a conversation. That when someone says, "I think this is a justice issue," the person they're talking with is almost unable to stay in a dialogue, and so that's a word. I wish there were a word that carried that weight in a different way.
Yeah. What turns you on?
Turns me on. I love listening to music and being with my wife and daughters, granddaughters. Today, as we're recording, is one of the best baseball days in the whole year. It's the
Hmm.
beginning of the playoffs. So all of that, yeah,
And what turns you off?
turns me off. Um, what turns me off? Um, hmm. I am pretty blessed and fortunate and privileged, and that's, I think, something that would turn me off. I just try to pivot toward a way I would rather spend my time and something I'd rather think about. So, yeah.
What sound or noise do you love?
Um, I love the sound of jazz music, the sound of bluegrass music, uh, those sounds. Yeah.
Okay. What sound do you hate?
What sound do I hate? I would say I hate the sound of the shrill sound that I hear primarily on cable news. And I don't listen to that a lot, but that would be, I would say cable news probably turns me off, and as well, but the
Mhm.
shrill sound of voices. Yeah.
What profession other than yours would you like to attempt one day?
I think I'd like to be either a country music songwriter or a baseball scout. Those would be two great things. Yeah.
What profession would you never want to do?
Probably an actuary or an accountant, and I would be terrible at those. That's probably why I would not want to do them.
It's the
Yeah.
most consistent answer. Yeah. And when you arrive at the marriage supper of the Lamb, what do you want to hear God say?
Um, I think I'd want to hear voices and see the faces of my grandmother and grandfather and mother, and some people I've known along the way, some older ministers, a couple of teachers, and I'd like to hear. I think my just that my grandmother would have prepared some of this food that we were eating. That's what I'd love to hear.
That's great. That's great. Well, Ken, thank you for giving me your time. And
Thank
thanks for
you,
the book.
Jason. Thank you for all that you do. Yeah.
Well, I don't do that.